Okay, hello, my name's Helena. I studied in the Slavonic Studies faculty of the University of Cambridge, and for the past few years I've been living in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kiev, working and researching there. And I'm very happy and excited to have been invited to Berlin to talk to you about this visionary, conceptual group of architects who were living and working in Moscow in the 1980s. Deserter, escapist, dissident, fanciful, and worst of all, anti-Soviet. All these were labels that were given to this group of architects, the paper architects as they dubbed themselves, who were working in Moscow in the 1980s. And the name comes from the fact that all the things they designed were never, in fact, intended to be built. It would all stay on paper, in 2D, in an imaginary form forever. So you can see that we're starting this lecture with a sort of visual contradiction. On the left, we have the official version of city planning from the authorities of the Soviet Union. This is the map of Moscow that was produced specifically for the 1980 Olympic Games that were held in Moscow. And you can see it's very legible as a version of the city. Everything is very clearly laid out. It's in concentric circles around this center of power, the Kremlin, which is in the center. And this is in complete contrast to this design, which is on the right. And this design is for a sepulchral skyscraper by Iurii Avvakumov, who was really the leader of this paper architecture movement. And this is the building that I will be focusing on later on in this presentation. But this is just an initial image to show the difference between these conceptions of how the city space should work. So there are a few quotations that I find useful when thinking about the work of this group of architects. The first is from Italo Calvino's most famous work, Invisible Cities. And he says, "With cities, it is as with dreams. Everything imaginable can be dreamed, but even the most unexpected dream is a rebus that conceals a desire, or its reverse, a fear." And the second quotation is from a recent book by the current director of the Design Museum in London, Dejan Sujic. And he says, "Cities are formed as much by ideas as they are by things." And then going back a couple of centuries, we have a quotation from Victor Hugo and his famous novel, Notre Dame de Paris. So this comes from a chapter, the entirety of which is devoted to the struggle between literature and architecture. And he declares that literature, or paper, will in fact win out. And this was actually only included in the second edition of the novel, not the initial one. But he says, "L'architecture est détrônée. Aux lettres de pierre d'Orphée vont succéder les lettres de plomb de Gutenberg. Le livre va tuer l'édifice." So architecture is dethroned. Gutenberg's leaden letters will succeed Orpheus's stone letters. The book will kill the edifice. And I think that's a very nice metaphor to think about how these paper architects were operating and thinking towards the end of the Soviet Union. So who were the paper architects? It's hard to speak of it as a kind of cohesive movement because they all had such individual styles, and they were all working on their own projects. But I think what unites them is that they were all imagining more unusual, liberated ways of living in a context that wasn't very liberated at all. And it's difficult to describe them as sort of pure architects. A lot of commentators actually say that they exist on the boundary, so between architecture, graphic art, and conceptualism, which is what a lot of people describe as, Russia's version of postmodernism. And then we have a list of some of the key players in the movement. And as I already said, Avvakumov is really the de facto leader. He's the one who's preserved all the designs. He was the one who gave the group their name. And he was the one who I managed to interview last week about his feelings about paper architecture. And funnily enough, a lot of his opinions about his work and the work of his group sort of diverge a lot from theorists' versions. So that will be interesting to look at. They were a group of students in their third year at the Moscow Institute of Architecture. And the only outlet they actually had for their designs was international competitions, which were mostly based in Japan. So they would gather their ideas, they would work on projects, and then just send them off by ordinary post to Japan or the UK or the US or wherever. And actually they encountered quite a lot of problems trying to send these designs abroad, because obviously the Soviet administration wasn't too happy about these sort of fantastical anti-Soviet designs leaving the country to represent the state. So a couple of their designs actually had to be sent via Soviet Women magazine because they had a lot more posting freedoms. So they had to always be finding ways to negotiate with the restrictions that were placed on them. And their first exhibition, which is when they thought up this name, was in 1984. So to give a bit of context, a very quick whiz through 20th century architecture in Russia. Post-revolution, as we've already talked about a bit today, there was this euphoric feeling, utopian feeling, anything is possible because the revolution has been achieved, we can do anything. So there was a lot of avant-garde work in all disciplines, but especially architecture and experimentation, of course. And then from the beginning of the 30s, this official doctrine, Stalinist socialist realism, gets proclaimed, and this neoclassicist monumental style sort of is in place until Khrushchev, when there was really a sort of standardized construction. So very utilitarian. We have these Khrushchevki, these 5-story buildings, which all look the same. And recently there's been a bit of controversy about that in Moscow. But it's really the era of prefabrication and lack of imagination, you could say. Moving forward, a word that's often used to describe architecture in the Brezhnev era is khaltura, which literally means in Russian like shoddy work. So there was a general feeling that, you know, architecture wasn't in a very good place at that time, and the things that were being constructed weren't very worthy of praise. And then we come to the early 1980s, which is when the paper architects were working. And still there were a lot of economical difficulties. The state was still controlling cultural production and ideology, and there was very little room for imagination or deviation from architects. If they wanted to work in the industry, they had to conform to state-sanctioned projects. They couldn't really branch out by themselves. So I thought we could look at a few examples of their designs to begin with. The big image in the middle is by Vyacheslav Mizin, and it's a design for a living complex, which is actually in the shape of a bird. And he was accused of escapism for this, because the text that accompanies it describes the bird being built and taking off into some fantastical land. And on the right, this is a design for a Russian dollhouse. So a house in the shape of a Russian doll. It has all these different layers, these different skins, all of which kind of enclose the person inside. And the text that accompanies this image describes it as a living capsule with different skins that mirror the skins that accumulate around humans over the course of their lifetimes. So you can see that sort of usefulness and workability weren't really priorities for these artists or architects or whatever we want to call them. They're more focused on metaphorical beauty, sort of playful forms and tongue-in-cheek details in their designs. This slide is one of the most famous works by Brodsky and Utkin, who are, again, some of the most famous representatives of this movement. It's called Crystal Palace, And it's not actually a building, it's a collection of glass planes that is arranged in such a way that from a distance it looks like it's a building, and then as you approach it up close, it becomes clear that it's a mirage, it's nothing substantial at all. And the text reads, "Crystal Palace is a beautiful but unrealizable dream, a mirage which calls you always, seen at the edge of the visible. A mirage remains simply a mirage, though it can be touched." And then we have some more colorful examples of paper architecture, which I think look more like conceptual paintings than detailed blueprints. So here we have Morozov's Man with a Sad Face, with a human made of the same stuff as his surroundings. And this work here is called Dwelling for Tomorrow, which is a sort of psychedelic, futuristic parallel universe, like something out of Zamyatin's We, or some kind of Escher riddle or drawing. So I wanted to talk a bit about how we might identify postmodern attitudes or postmodern tropes in the work of the paper architects, because I think it would be overly simplistic to assert that it was a postmodernist movement. Rather, we can analyze how they approach their work with irony, and how sort of postmodernist ideas manifest themselves in their work. And again, it would be difficult to talk about one definition of postmodernism. So here I've included a few ways in which we might identify postmodernism in this movement. Mikhail Epstein, who is a well-respected professor of Russian culture, Russian studies, he actually says that postmodernism is central to Russian identity, not as a historical movement, but as a sort of way of thinking, which I think is interesting in relation to this movement. So I would say the main ways in which their approach was postmodern was the way they collected historical details and historical styles and blended them together to make their designs. So their works are really a pastiche of aesthetic elements. It's very eclectic. They use a lot of irony and quotations in their work. And obviously they reject these grandiose meta-narratives of Stalinism. That's what Stalinism was all about. It was about these meta-narratives of the people and this glorious leader and the great patriotic war and this Russian victory over fascism. And we can see in the work of the paper architects that they challenge this. So they look at things that are more personal or individual, or they choose to construct a different grandiose meta-narrative as a sort of way of challenging this original one. And of course, their mistrust of the construction process. It's as if by building a design, you're committing some kind of violence or betrayal of the original idea. So they prefer to stick to sort of what they call чистые идеи, чистые формы, like pure ideas and pure forms. So here we have a few of the influences on their work. Piranesi especially influenced Brodsky and Utkin. As we saw before, you can see just from their etchings that they really took inspiration from Piranesi. In fact, they even marked their etchings to sort of make them look old. And especially Iurii Avvakumov especially is influenced by the Russian constructivists. So we've talked a bit about this already today. We have the Tatlin Tower here, and a lot of his designs and maquettes are actually towers looking very similar to this one. And Melnikov, who's also come up today, and here is his famous house in Moscow. So yeah, if we think about Frederick Jameson's definition of pastiche. He says, pastiche is, like parody, the imitation of a peculiar or unique idiosyncratic style, the wearing of a linguistic mask, speech in a dead language. And in a way, that's what these designs are doing. They're wearing all these different masks at once, they're using lots of different languages from the past, and they even include these sort of linguistic tropes in the texts that accompany the images. And we can see that repetition is, in fact, closely linked to irony and doubleness. And this is what a review of one of the paper architects' shows, which I found online, pointed out. It says that paper architecture in its way is a game, horseplay, the borders of which were not created by the architects, which the senses ignored because they saw no obvious threat in it. So it could be assumed, because we're saying there is some postmodern ideas in their work, and they're sort of playing with all this irony, you could assume that it would be a cynical movement, but I think that's not the case. I think the movement itself was very utopianist, and the main players in the movement have pointed that out as well, that they were attempting to build a new kind of space for people to live in the Soviet Union. And this is a very interesting design from 1991 called the Sportsmen's Podium Parliament. And it's essentially a sort of triangular-shaped structure with different levels, which allows up to, let's say, 6 different orators to be speaking at one time to the public, to have their voices heard. And when it's not being used as a speech platform, it can be converted into a diving board for sports practices. So I think that's quite a nice metaphor for elevating the ordinary man and sort of finding some kind of solidarity and making yourself heard in the midst of the late Soviet Union, but at the same time it's sort of tongue-in-cheek poking fun at this culture of fizkultura and the Soviet obsession with sports. And here are another couple of what I would call utopianist projects. On the left, this is called the Flying Proletariat. It's actually dedicated to Mayakovsky. It's difficult to explain what it is. So it says it's kind of a theme park ride, and with 2 teams of people, 6 on each side, and they each have a lever which controls these wings. I don't know if you can see, but here there are wings, and whichever team sort of controls these wings better flies higher. So it's a constant sort of battle to the top as they realize this tug-of-war kind of game. And on the right, this is Iurii Avvakumov with one of his most iconic designs, which is a house of cards. And it's supposedly self-building, but it's also collapsible. And he was actually told by his teacher in the Moscow Institute of Architecture that he absolutely couldn't be doing this. This was anti-Soviet. It was clearly a metaphor for the Soviet Union. Because, his house of cards built on shaky foundations. At any moment, it could come tumbling down. But according to him, this wasn't exactly his intention. It was more a playful experimentation, sort of pushing the boundaries. How far can we go? What kind of fantastical structures can we dream up to live in the city? So he himself said many projects were based on the idea of a local utopia and a total dystopia, which consciously restricted the ambitions of the architect. So it's this idea of having pockets of utopia and places to exist in a landscape which is actually quite bleak. He also calls paper architecture mirage oasisa v pustynia, so the mirage of an oasis in the desert. And Khomyakov as well, who is another one of the main players, very recently wrote an article in which he said that paper architecture was at once utopian and anti-utopia. Anti-utopian because by definition, a utopia is unrealizable and tragic. And I think the fact that all their designs were in fact unrealizable plays into this very well. So now we come on to the main focus of the presentation, which is this self-building sepulchral skyscraper, designed in 1983 by Avvakumov and Mikhail Belov. So it's kind of made of prefabricated blocks, and there's a crane in the middle in the shape of a cross, which I think is a nice ironic nod to the original design for a cemetery, a Christian cemetery. And in theory, it can keep building itself forever. So the crane is controlled remotely. These pieces of concrete or whatever are stored somewhere until they're needed, and more graves sort of are placed inside. There's a lift, supposedly, that goes up the middle, so you can visit loved ones' graves. And here we have a little floor plan, and an image of the skyscraper actually touching the clouds. And here are some more detailed images. So each floor would be 900 meters squared, according to the design. So I think it's important, if we're analyzing this building, thinking about what it meant in the Soviet Union, to think about graves, death, and how these were approached in the Soviet Union. So obviously, you can't talk about death or burial in the Soviet Union without talking about this guy and his pyramid. Avvakumov, in one of his essays, actually calls Lenin the ideological corpse. And it's true, because he was, and he still is, very much in the center of Russian life. He's right in the center of Red Square. He's physically present. And Avvakumov also said that life in the Soviet Union was like living in a tomb or a mausoleum, which I think is something interesting to ponder. There is a very interesting American academic called Nina Tumarkin, and she has written a lot about death in the USSR and identified some main trends or themes. So the first one she identifies is this cult of immortality, which immediately after the revolution sort of exploded, because again there was this euphoric feeling post-revolution. The socialist state can do anything. The socialist state can even overcome death physically, and they had these institutes dedicated to research in order to make humans immortal. And the embalming and preservation of Lenin's body was obviously part of that. They wanted to keep his body safe until it could potentially be brought back to life in future. She also notes the desacralization of death, so a sort of move towards atheism, an acceptance of mass graves, which didn't exist before, sort of almost depersonalization as well of the process of dying. And then after 1945, obviously that has a huge impact, because Russia really lost, the Soviet Union really lost a lot of people in this Second World War, which they call the Great Patriotic War. And that really left a mark on the collective consciousness. And this cult of sort of heroes, war heroes, self-sacrifice became embedded as the main national narrative of the USSR. And she makes quite an important and nuanced observation, I think, which is that after this point, attitudes to death really differed depending on whose death it was. So if it was the death of a war hero, they would be constantly visible. There'd be so many memorials, it would be very public. Even today, we have in Russia this march on the 9th of May where people carry placards with images of their relatives who died in this great patriotic war. But then increasingly, the death of ordinary citizens would be something hidden, private, something that didn't really enter the public sphere. So in that way, I think the Sepulchral Skyscraper is actually very daring and anti-authoritarian, because it specifically makes the death of ordinary citizens something public. It puts them into the public space. It makes it something that is visible, something that people talk about. I'm not going to dwell on the symbolism of the tower because there isn't much time left, but this is something that Avvakumov himself really emphasizes. He has a whole article about the theory of the tower, and what I think is most interesting is he finds it a way of liberating man from the gravitational pull of the earth, and it gives man a kind of power. The man on top of a hill, a tower, a skyscraper, has more knowledge and a better vision than the one on the earth. And he also describes towers as essentially bogoprotivna, which is a very strong word, meaning against God. And I think in this context, we could even take it to mean against this sort of authority from above. So to sum up, I think there's not really any doubt about the impact that this phenomenon had on contemporary culture in Russia. So Selim Khan Magomedov, who is actually the most authoritative historian of Soviet architecture at the moment, he said that there were only 3 phenomena in 20th century Russian architecture that have achieved global status. So those include the 20s avant-garde, constructivism, Stalinist neoclassicism, and paper architecture. And if we think about the question, to what extent was the movement Soviet or anti-Soviet? We can identify, I think, certain anti-Soviet elements. Of course, it was very anti-industrial. And this idea of being bogoprotivna, opposite the higher power, I think is very much embedded in their works. But there's also a sense that instead of being anti-Soviet, it was more non-Soviet. It just didn't take into account this Soviet context. It was more about opening up new fields of possibilities, and finding something more personal, more individualistic, and more funny than what was officially Soviet. As for their vision for the city, I think what stands out more than anything else is that they wanted a place where ordinary people could exist, live, and take up space. So maybe this is the ultimate postmodern irony of the Sepulchral Skyscraper, in that the only way that Soviet citizens could comfortably, sort of unashamedly exist in the urban spaces was as corpses. And to finish, we have an image of a design from 2013 by a Norwegian student for a vertical graveyard. And this isn't the only one. In the recent years, there have been really a lot of designs for skyscrapers where you can bury people. And Avvakumov said he never imagined that this, in fact, would realize itself, let alone within his lifetime. So I think there's a nice symmetry in the fact that his ideas, his paper ideas, are now becoming reality.
Thank you, Helena. Yes, we have questions.
Thank you. And I wanted to ask, paper architects were following very different professional trajectories after this period of paper architects, of paper architecture in the 90s and later. So do you have an opinion or a comment about the emancipation from theory, from this conceptual work into later practice?
From what I've read, it sort of came about by necessity. as they grew older, they had to find ways of supporting themselves, of actually finding jobs, so they all went their separate ways. So Avvakumov found work as a curator. Brodsky is now a sort of conceptual artist, architect, building actual things. And a lot of them now just work on ordinary projects for the city. I also think it was very much of its time, and after the fall of the Soviet Union, perhaps wouldn't have had the same effect that it did in the 1980s. It was pretty much over by 1990.
Some of them they are doing quite classical and boring architecture right now.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that's what Avvakumov says as well. He says that revolution is for the young, and as people grow old, this is what happens.
Yes, we have one more question from there.
Their day jobs, so they were students, yep. And then they worked in architectural bureau, basically in Moscow, yeah.
So I have a comment about this vertical cemetery, which exists not only as a design, but also as a form of real estate speculation in Hong Kong, where there's not enough land in the city to bury the growing number of dead, so it became very common to speculate with illegal burial spaces that are in skyscrapers in the middle of the city. And I think trying to link it with the project you presented opens also an interesting question about how postmodernism is always linked to capitalism and to speculation, and in a way it only unfolds through various form of capitalist speculation. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because Iurii Avvakumov says that his design wasn't actually intended for the Soviet Union space. It was universal. It could have been for any city. And it was, although it was ironic, it was intended as like an actual solution to a practical problem in that there's not enough space to bury people, and it becomes costly and difficult to maintain. Yeah, I think it is a capitalist problem, and I think he acknowledges that as well. He said in the Soviet Union, that wasn't actually a problem because all the land was publicly owned, and obviously they had a lot of land, so this wasn't really a solution for a problem that they were facing. It was more a kind of solution for a problem that's universal for humanity.